Hello, welcome. I'm Basha Cummings. I'm an editor at Tortoise. Thank you all for joining us. I know it's a really gloomy Thursday evening in a really gloomy week, in a particularly harrowing 24 hours, both on the COVID front and in the US. So what I'm hoping is over the next hour in this conversation, we'll have a chance to escape a bit, to talk about adventure and love and mountains with the brilliant Ed Caesar, the New Yorker writer who's joining us this evening and whose book we've all been reading, I hope, and it's fantastic. And we'll be talking about that too. If this is your first thinking, let me just quickly go through how it works. I know some of you have joined us before, but really we want to hear from as many of you as we can. So get involved. You can either participate in the chat, which my colleague Phoebe is going to be manning, and you can put questions for Ed in there, or thoughts or ideas. There's Phoebe. And one of the things I thought, which I think I would find really joyful on this gloomy evening, is I was thinking that we all definitely deserve some kind of post-pandemic gap year. And so I would love it if you would share your dreams and adventures that you're boiling away for after 2021 is over and this pandemic is over. So do share whatever you're kind of plotting in the spirit of Maurice Wilson, who we're going to talk about this evening. So that's kind of, and you can also raise your digital hand. That's another way that you can participate, and I'll come to many of you to try and get you to participate on video as well. So that's the housekeeping. So to Ed. Hi, Ed. Can we hear Ed?
Sorry, I'll just unmute to myself. Hello, everyone.
Hello. How are you? Where are you in lockdown?
I'm in Manchester, Britain's premier city, and we've been in lockdown since 1947, and so this is all old hat for us, really. Like, we had a couple of weeks in the summer when we were briefly allowed to go to a restaurant with our family, but apart from that, we've just been holding tight. So that's where I am, and that's what I'm doing.
You're clinging on.
Yeah.
Aren't we all? Should we first dive in and talk about the book, which is brilliant, and I've got lots of questions for you, and then let's bring some other people in who might have also read the book or have questions for you about your writing or about any of the adventures that we might have put in their mind. So you came across an amazing character in Maurice, this 35-year-old World War I war veteran who had no climbing experience, no flying experience, and got it into his head that he would fly from London to the Himalayas and climb up Everest alone. How did you come across this character?
I read about Maurice Wilson in a brilliant book called Into the Silence by Wade Davis. And Into the Silence is a book about the effect of the First World War on a generation of climbers who went to Everest in the 1920s, tried to climb Everest in the 1920s. And Maurice Wilson was a couple of paragraphs in that doorstep book, but it adumbrated the tale. It told about this man who'd, with no climbing experience, no flying experience, who'd flown and then tried to climb Everest. And I was totally gripped by it. And then did a lot of other reading and found other books about Wilson, one from the 50s, all sorts of kind of spurious and poorly researched articles about him. And he was considered, I think, a footnote in the history of Everest. And what I came to think was I would like to, first of all, know a lot more about him. Something about his story was incredibly gripping. The idea of this man who left behind a broken life to go and try and climb Everest was really interesting to me. And it took me about 4 or 5 years to actually pluck up the courage to really dive in and start researching the book. So I read that Wade Davis book in 2011, and I started work on the book in around 2015, 2016. But in that intervening period, I was or, you know, I was thinking about Wilson from time to time, and sometimes I would wake up in the night thinking about Maurice Wilson. And I think those are the stories that you have to write. So if someone nags away at you for a while, those are the ones that you have to do.
Yeah. And you kind of, you reconstruct this world, particularly Maurice's world, which was, you know, there wasn't a lot of documentation about him. He had a diary, there were some letters, but the recurring theme in the writing is about, you know, desperately trying to make sense of this character. But you build this world around him in such a compelling way. What were those, I think it was 9 years in total, what was the research like? Where did it sort of take you? Because you talk about postage stamps and stamps in his passport and trying to find ship registries about where he might have gone. I mean, it feels at times like a detective novel.
Well, I mean, thank you. I suppose it was nightmarish, frankly, the research for this. I was, you know, he lived a very peripatetic life. So after the First World War, this boy who had gone to war, the son of a mill owner from Bradford, had after the war he'd come back and he'd attempted to start a new life in Bradford, and it hadn't worked out. And then he'd gone all around the world: New Zealand, Canada, America, Mozambique, continental Europe, and he left behind these shreds of evidence everywhere. So I found him on ships' manifests with women who were not his wife. I found him crossing borders, you know, from Canada to America. I found this box of letters in a basement in Bremen in northern Germany. I found incredible amounts of interesting detail about his second wife in New Zealand with the help of a wonderful archivist in Wellington, New Zealand. And piece by piece, you can put the story together. You know, you realize that you can't know everything, but there are periods of his life in which you can know much more than you might have imagined you could. And in fact, one of the most fun things was actually just to think about his childhood in pre-war Bradford. So I was in the West Yorkshire Archive Service an awful lot, looking at his school, looking at his contemporaries, and trying to piece together the story of this incredible city. Like, Bradford was the most exciting city to live in the early years of the 20th century, the capital of the world's wool trade. It had the first, you know, really great tram system. It had a brilliant symphony orchestra. There was fun stuff going on all the time. Like, you know, the world's first passenger air service went from Leeds to Bradford in 1914. All that stuff was just brilliant. And there is Wilson in his short trousers looking up in the sky at these planes as a 16-year-old, finishing his school at Carlton Road Secondary. And all of that was really fun. But yes, it took an awful long time. And just towards the end of my research, I eventually found a living relative who had this little box of treasure. And that really was the end of the detective story for me. That was when I knew that I had found everything that I was going to find.
You talk about Bradford, and it's true that it's so vivid in your writing. And you also talk about in the book how he kind of came of age at this moment of great British exploration. So in 1916, there had been the Shackleton attempt. Then he comes of age in the 20s, where there were obviously, it was like the real golden age of Everest exploration. And there was, of course, part of that, the kind of colonial impulse to go and claim it and plant the flag. And how much, because he's such a complicated character, and you know, you're trying to sort of reconstruct him from such scant evidence. How much do you think that he was motivated, you know, being such an amateur that he was, by the sort of fever in the air around him about going and doing these great things, particularly after the war, where there was a generation of men who had experienced such trauma, but then sort of found their lives at a bit of a dead end? And how much of it was sort of him as a character, that he had this inbuilt romanticism, that he just had to be this kind of grand protagonist of his own life?
Yeah, I think it was a mixture of motivations. That's what makes him such an interesting character, for me at least. He was, you can see from his letters that he paid a huge amount of attention, in particular to the 1933 expedition to Everest, which was led by Hugh Rutledge. And just a little side note here, Hugh Rutledge's book about the 1933 expedition is absolutely wonderful. It's a short book about an expedition most people don't know about, and you'd have to, I think, buy it on A Books or something. But he's a beautiful writer. He was a slightly hapless expedition leader, but he writes beautifully about Everest and talks about it as this kind of almost psychedelic experience. So Wilson was paying an awful lot of attention to Rutledge and that party because he wanted to beat them. So he felt that he was in competition with some of those adventurers. And he certainly felt some of the same impulses, you know, those Shackletonian impulses. When Shackleton gets to Elephant Island after this absolutely harrowing ordeal of many months, he writes in his diary that we have reached the naked soul of men. And that was what Wilson was trying to access. He was trying to find this missing part of him, I think. It was a journey, it was an interior journey as much as it was a real physical adventure.
And that's a theme in so much great kind of mountaineering writing. You know, I read a while ago and then reread it while I was thinking about this for this evening, the David Gran piece about Henry Worsley,
Wow. Yeah.
which is one of the most wonderful pieces of writing about adventure, but also about that inward journey. And similarly, he had, you know, a familial connection to the Shackleton trip, and he was sort of clearly working through so much himself. And then you've interviewed Reinhard Messner, who also has this kind of real complicated interior life that you sort of tried to get to the heart of. And that's not unusual in many of the characters that you write about. Were you sort of aware of that as a theme when you approached Maurice?
I'm very interested in people who express interior pain, weakness, yearning through these big expressive acts. So trying to climb to the top of Everest is a theatrical thing to do, particularly for Wilson. He's got no climbing experience. So it's you know, he's sending out these signs to the world that he wants to tell them. He wants to tell the world something about himself. And I am interested in those people. Messner was hugely interesting to me. He's not an easy character to know, I don't think. I mean, when I met him, he was incredibly frosty, but he is a wonderful writer about those journeys of the soul. His book about the 1980 solo of Everest, The Crystal Horizon, is fantastically interesting. It's very weird, but he becomes kind of, you know, lost in these visions about Maurice Wilson. He's a day's climb from the summit, and he's thinking, if Maurice Wilson were up here, he'd get there. Am I as tough as him? I'm a fool who with his longing for love and tenderness runs up cold mountains. I mean, it is wonderful stuff. I am drawn to those stories, I think. Something about maleness, actually, I think is quite interesting. And I wrote a little bit about this after the book came out. It's odd, actually. Sometimes you have to write the book to know why you wrote it. But I wrote about this childhood experience. I lost my dad, who was a pilot, very accomplished Navy pilot, when I was 2 years old in an accident. And there was this poem, High Flight, which is a paean to flying and the joys of flying. And that used to live on top of the piano in our living room. And I used to stare at that poem almost every day, and I memorized it. And I was thinking about how much this idea of adventure and high flight and all of that got under my skin as a very young boy, and how I think I've probably been dealing with some of those. You know, I've been thinking about why men in particular, but why people have those impulses and what it is that they're trying to achieve. Yeah,
because there's some relationship with your earlier sort of big topic, which was running. And I want, you know, running and writing for you were intertwined quite a bit at some time. I know you've recently started running again. But I wondered whether what your relationship with mountains was, or mountaineering, or you know, Everest was before you found Maurice. Was it something that you were intrigued about it through your kind of interest in endurance and the kind of the spirit of adventure, or was it something new to you?
No, hardly at all, actually. And all the things that were interesting to me about his story were the non-mountaineering aspects of it. So the First World War was incredibly interesting to me. Has always been. I think when I read Birdsong as a 17-year-old and was, absolutely amazed by that book as a teenager. That kind of vivid description of warfare and loss can have quite a big effect on you. The books I think that you read between 17 and 21 have this kind of outsized influence on you, and things like Blunden, Undertones of War, and all of those great novels of the kind of the late 20s and early 30s. So I was interested in that in a way much more than I was interested in Everest. The thing that was interesting to me about Into the Silence, which was Wade Davis's book about the 1920s Everest expeditions, was less what they did on the mountain and more what they did in Europe before they even tried to get to Everest. I was interested in motivation rather than sort of daring do.
I'm glad that you raised it, because I was reading this afternoon some of Nan Shepherd's book, The Living Mountain, which is a beautiful piece of writing and written not that long after Maurice Wilson would have been kind of embarking on his adventure, and not long after the kind of craze of the 20s and 30s and trying to summit Everest. And it really struck me that this was a piece of writing that wasn't about trying to conquer a mountain or get to the top of it. It was just about being on it and in it. And it was a kind of deep understanding of being in mountains rather than trying to use it as a means to an end, which I think perhaps is, I wasn't sure if that was a gendered difference, whether that was because she was a woman and that she didn't have that same kind of need to, I don't know, need to sort of conquer, or whether it was a geographical thing. But I wonder, have you reflected a bit on the kind of gender dimension? Clearly you have a bit.
Yes. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, the language that we all use. We conquer mountains and there are virgin peaks. I mean, I think a Freudian analyst would have quite a lot to say about those terms. I mean, it does feel quite male, although there are many brilliant female mountaineers. And I was also quite interested in the story of Tom Ballard and his mum Alison Hargreaves, who was a great climber who died on K2. So you don't want to break things down too much on gender terms, but I mean, the key thing that I keep on coming back to is that mountains don't need us. Mountains are inanimate. They don't care if you get to the top of them. People have lived in the in the shade of Everest or Chomolungma for thousands of years without ever feeling the need to climb it. This is a modern, it's a Victorian really invention. Mountaineering started in the 1850s in the Alps, and so it's worth considering why we need to get to the top of these things.
Well, let's see if some of our audience might have some answers. I see a couple of people have their hands up. Should we come first to William Jeremy? Are you there? You look like you might be in a mountaineering sort of cave or something.
Well, yes, I'm in a box room, which feels a bit like a mountain cave. Ed, I wondered whether you had read Cecil Lewis's amazing book, Sagittarius Rising, which is his account. I mean, he lived the entire century, but he was one of the first Royal Flying Corps pilots over the Western Front. He went straight from school, age 17, to train for 6 weeks, and then found himself flying the whole of the rest of the First World War from about 1916 through. And he then spent the rest of his life trying to work out what all that was about. And I very much picked on what you said about motivation. And for him, it was about trying to find spirituality and he went very mystic. I mean, he helped set up the BBC in the 1920s. And then but what distinguished the rest of his life was that he couldn't settle to one thing. He had to go questing. And he very much thought that was part and parcel of his wartime experience, which he then repeated in the Second World War. He ended up training Spitfire pilots, and he trained his own son to be a Spitfire pilot.
Yeah.
What is it, do you think, about a certain stripe of chap in the main from the 1850s to the 1950s, I guess, and on, that mountains, Arctic wastelands, sailing, the oceans, that there's a certain kind of fellow who needs to find something out there because it's not quite apparent. Perhaps it's something in his education, perhaps it's something lacking in his education, in all our educations, about what it's really about. But there's I suppose desert's the same. T.E. Lawrence and all that. Wondered whether you had a...
Yeah, I think there are two things here. I think there are two things here, which is that at its height, the British Empire encouraged the idea that you needed to plant a flag at every corner of the globe. And that is, you can see that in there is an imperial motivation in a lot of the people, particularly pre-First World War. So Victorian and then Edwardian adventurers, you can really see that imperial impulse. The really interesting thing about restlessness is what happens after the First World War. So specifically between 1918 and about 1929, when 1928, when the first books, really interesting books and plays come out about the First World War, there's this period of kind of concussion where it's very difficult for people in Britain to talk about what's just happened in France and Flanders. And I really hadn't appreciated this until I got into some of the literature around in the 20s. Herbert Reed, who became a very brilliant critic, he fought alongside or about a mile down the road from Maurice Wilson in the Spring Offensive of 1918. And then he wrote a very brilliant, straightforward piece of nonfiction about the Spring Offensive and his experiences called In Retreat. And he wrote that in 1919, and nobody would publish it. My magazine now, or any magazine or publisher would tear his arm off for the right to publish it in normal times, but nobody would publish an unvarnished account of what it was like to fight on the Western Front until Hogarth Press, Virginia Woolf's publishers, did so in 1925. And it really wasn't for another 3 or 4 years after that that a slew of books and plays and poems came out, really for the mass market, about what it was like to be there. And many people who had fought found themselves feeling restless and unable really to live in the country that they had come back to. Herbert Reed said that there was a dark screen of horror and violation between people who had served and people who had not. And you could imagine what that was like, particularly in Wilson's Bradford. So on Cecil Avenue in Bradford, where Wilson grew up, there were 9 boys who had not come home. And 9 boys of Wilson's age, just on his streets. The PALS battalions meant that people who joined up together served together. So whole, particularly, and it particularly affected the north, but whole towns had lost their young men. And I think, you know, you see it in George Mallory, and you see it in a lot of those early Everest expeditions, the pioneer flyers. There was this huge feeling of restlessness. I just want to be somewhere else. I need to keep moving like a swift. I just don't want to touch the ground. So I think there's a general thing about the British Imperial Project and how that led into adventures, but I think there's a very specific point about what happened to people after their experiences on the Western Front.
I might just pick up on that because it was something that I really noticed reading your book, was how directly you deal with mental health, and you know, where I think other poorer mountaineering books and sort of non-fiction around some of these characters would portray these men who had clearly sort of inner turmoil. They were either sort of brooding or macho or just sort of possessed by ambition. It didn't really interrogate, in many of them, the sort of, you know, you talk about Maurice Wilson's anxiety and his depression and the trauma that he carries with him, and that felt quite different to me. Was that something consciously that you were trying to do to unpack the kind of the easy picture of the sort of possessed mountaineer?
I think so. I was very, very wary of him becoming an eccentric. Like eccentrics are, you know, they're clowns, and he wasn't a clown to me, because he'd experienced these real, you know, these real traumas, and his brother Victor was so badly shaken up by the First World War that he couldn't sleep, and his eyelids shook and his whole body quivered, and he couldn't work, and he spent time in, you know, care homes as a 25-year-old, being looked after because of his neurasthenia. So I wanted to dig into what people understood about the effect of war on mental health at the time, and how we might understand it a little bit with the benefit of hindsight. And I think, you know, there is a narrative about the First World War and shell shock that, you know, British doctors were sort of callous in dealing with troops who had suffered what we would now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder or variations of that. Actually, the picture is much more complicated. There were many brilliant and sensitive doctors at work. And if you want to read a really incredible book about this, Ben Shepherd wrote a book called War of Nerves, which is about military psychiatry. And so I wanted to interrogate that a bit. And I was just so moved when I read in Wilson's diary that when he was at the foot of the North Col about to undertake his last day of climbing on Everest, or his last days of climbing on Everest, how frightened he was for the first time, this real vulnerability. And he says, I couldn't sleep for my aching nerves. And then he has this very potent waking dream or vision about someone else being in the tent with him. And you can see his mind unraveling at that point, which is, I still find it incredibly moving to think about this person going through that all on his own in a tent at 21,000 feet.
Yeah, well, you captured it pretty remarkably. Let's come now to David Shoesmith, who's had his hand up for a while. Hello.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. And Ed, thank you for the book, which I enjoyed immensely. It really lifted the veil on Maurice Wilson, who, up until the point of reading that book, really was a footnoted eccentric in sort of climbing literature, and to the accounts of his, you know, his motivations and his rationality. I think you've done us a great service, so thank you for that. I'm really interested in the points around the sort of post-Victorian, post-First World War generation, the experiences that people went through, the society that they came back to, and indeed the families they came back to, the difficulty of expressing what they'd experienced difficulty of being able to share those experiences. And indeed, that kind of experience for many veterans was repeated after the end of the Second World War. I'm really interested in your kind of take on kind of military veterans and climbers, and what it is that drives those sort of communities. You've sort of touched on it a little bit. And I wonder whether you're so bold as to say, had Maurice Wilson not fought in the First World War, what would his destiny have been? Did he still have that drive to be able to go and achieve the sort of things that he aspired to achieve?
So I would thank you so much for those kind words. And I would say that had the First World War not come along and wrecked both his prospects and both, you know, physically and materially wrecked his family, his city, the nation in which he was hoping to prosper, I think he would have been a, you know, mid-level person in the textile industry. He would have had quite a comfortable bourgeois life somewhere in the West Riding, and that would have been that. He wouldn't have troubled biographers or historians. I might be wrong, but I think that's probably true. He was a clever, you know, polyglot, you know, sporty kid from Bradford, and he was transformed, as many people were, by his experiences. There's a clear connection for me between what he went through on the Western Front and what happened to him to drive him to Everest. This talisman that he treasures, which is given to him in Darjeeling, is this cross with, which was taken from the corpse of a dead man on the Western Front, was given to him by his fiancée, and it says Amor Vincit Omnia on one side. And Wilson writes to his soulmate Enid when he gets this cross, you know, love is the greatest power on earth. What a pity more people don't know it. You know, those are the words of someone who felt things deeply and has experienced life in the raw. And you just don't fly a plane to the Himalayas and try and climb it on your own with no experience, unless there is something very persistent gnawing away at you. And you know, you don't want to draw a simple line between the war and that experience, but I think it's absolutely cast iron truth to say that he would not have tried to climb Everest had it not been for the First World War.
There's a great question in the chat, which I'll read out from Dave Lynch, because I know it's something, Ed, that you have thought about a lot, and we talked about it briefly earlier, which is asking you about the balance between truly non-fiction and fiction, and about how you kind of, I suppose, extrapolate a character when you know so relatively little about them, and how you sort of made peace with the sections, I guess, where you might have been imagining more than reporting. And given that your sort of normal job, your full-time job, is as a reporter, that must be quite a sort of strange diversion for you.
Yeah, I mean, there are whole swathes of his life that go by where you can't know very much. You can pick up little snippets here and there, and as a biographer, you have to know what to do with them. So I don't think I don't think it's bad of me to say this, but, you know, I took 3 pretty big swings at writing this book. There was one very long, slightly knotty, structurally version that was the first version, and then I pared it down. But the real breakthrough that I had was being more open about the moments in which I couldn't tell you what happened. So I have a section at the beginning of the book where I just say, this is how I came to be obsessed by Wilson, and this is what you can know, and this is how I've tried to find out. But there was a period, for instance, when he's in New Zealand, when you really can't know very much. And that is, you know, we breeze past 5 or 6 years there, you know, in a few pages. And I try to tell the reader when I don't know something. And it's a little bit like this. There's a Japanese art or kind of approach in ceramics, kintsugi, where they make cracks beautiful with by gilding the cracks and using this beautiful paint on cracks in broken pottery. And you know, kintsugi is extremely beautiful, and I think that's that to me was the approach for this book, to have a kind of kintsugi approach. Every time you couldn't see something, you tried to alert the reader in some way that's perhaps dug up some kind of more interesting thought about what it is that we are doing as biographers. I should say, though, that you know, the act of writing history is always an act of the imagination. It's an act of empathy, because you're trying to understand what happened long before you were alive, or you know, long before anyone you could speak to was alive, through historical records and through other books and through diaries and letters and ship's manifests. It is an act of the imagination. You hoping to get to a place of fact, but the way that you do that is by using all these more artistic methods of thinking.
I really like that kintsugi, the kintsugi approach. I'll come now to Mark Hayward, who has a fantastic backdrop. Hello. Oh, you're on. Oh no, you're unmuted. Are you?
You hear me now?
Yes. Hello.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, hello there. Yeah, no, it's not the real backdrop. I'm in a study actually, but I thought that would make it more interesting. Ed, you've mentioned restlessness as a thing that, you know, drives people to go to these and so on, and this takes various forms. People like Chris Bonington in particular have written a lot about how this seems to drive seasoned compulsive mountaineers into doing things which to many of other people would just seem very selfish and crazy and irresponsible. And I remember one lecture he was giving where he was asked, how did he reconcile that with having a wife and other responsibilities and being a family man and so on. And he said, well, he couldn't reconcile it. And you had to make whatever you like of that situation, that it was a paradox and it's just a thing that you live with, and it becomes a component part of mountaineer's life. You may not be able to answer this, but I'm just wondering with Maurice Wilson, if he hadn't been carrying all the baggage of the war trauma with him and everything that went with it, if he'd had what you refer to as a more comfortable, conventional middle-class life after coming out of the war, would that have restrained him? Would that have meant that he was less keen to do this crazy thing and fly to the Himalayas? Or would he just have gone anyway? Was it in his nature?
No, I don't think it was. I don't know. It's really it's interesting to think about, but you know, he was in many ways a despicable human being. If you think about his how he treated women, he was a bolter. You know, he ran away from 2 marriages. He left one young woman in New Zealand without enough money for her ship fare home, having to sue him for divorce. You know, something that scarred her for the rest of her life. So the restlessness, you know, he didn't find a way to square the circle or to resolve the paradox. And you know, it's kind of counterfactual to try and work out what he would have been like had all the things that happened to him not happened to him. But there's certainly, you know, his inability to form relationships and to be a good husband or boyfriend, but you know, that's part of the same person that takes you to Everest. I should just say on this point, you know, I sometimes grappled with this paradox myself, not because of mountains, but you know, there were occasions well, for a while, actually in my late 20s and up to, about 5 years ago, I used to cover conflict sometimes. And there was a point at which I'd had my first child, and I was in Bongi in the Central African Republic, covering a really nasty civil war, which was essentially sectarian, Muslim and Christian. And this kid with a weapon, an automatic weapon, fired 3 or 4 shots with me on my first morning in Bongi, and I dived behind a vehicle, and I don't think they missed me by very much. And I remember, I have a really clear memory on that day of thinking, what am I doing? I had a beautiful kind of 18-month-old little blonde cherub to go back to. And I thought, I've lost my mind. This is not worth doing. I know not all reporters who cover conflict feel the same way. It becomes addictive and whatever. But I had the opposite reaction. As soon as there was something really to lose, it became much less interesting to me. So I was able to not be restless so much anymore. I do still need adventure, but I take it in different ways. So yes, I think there is a relationship between the restlessness and what happens to you in your life, but it's kind of how you make those decisions and what is driving those decisions that is going to tell you what kind of person you're going to be, what kind of mountaineer, I suppose, in Bonington's case.
That leads me actually to a question that I wanted to ask you, which is about risk, because when I was reading some of Messner's writing and your interview with him, I think it was in GQ, he is absolutely, he scoffs at people who climb with ropes or with bolts. I think he called it the murder of the impossible. He has like a real purist view of what mountaineering is. And it's so connected clearly to sort of his view of himself and his view of kind of pursuit and ambition. But it struck me that there is, I mean, in every extreme sport, but particularly so in climbing and in mountaineering, this very tricky relationship between sort of purism and risk and sort of the drive to be the first. And I think you can see it particularly now where expeditions seem to get riskier and riskier. At the moment, we were talking earlier, I was telling you about this trip up K2 currently happening right now. They're at the base of it. They're trying to summit it for the first time in winter, and it's never been done before. And it's incredibly dangerous. And many of the kind of leading mountaineers in the world are saying, don't do it. It's going to be a tragedy. People are going to die. But the main people leading it have, hundreds of thousands of social media followers and are, doing Instagram stories from the base of the mountain. And it just struck me that there's this sort of this drive to be first combined with this sort of purism and this kind of high-minded philosophy about what people are doing. And it seems to sort of boil down to these incredibly risky trips that, like you say, for many people just seem bonkers. They make no sense.
Well, everyone calibrates risk differently, but you can't remove it from your life. So it's really a question of where you get to on the sort of sliding scale of risk. Some people don't ever let their kids cross a road until they're 18 or something. It's a question of what you're willing to accept for yourself and for other people. I would say that in the modern, there is the added wrinkle with modern alpinism or extreme sports is the social media pressure. It's not completely new in that you see newspapers have drummed up interest in people, and then people feel that they can't back out and whatever. But can you imagine having 500,000 Instagram followers and then saying, well, actually it's a little risky doing this thing that I've told you all I'm going to do. It does. I mean, it would drive you on, but it has its own dangers, I think, because you're not making decisions objectively. If I went to climb, my first mountain, I would tell almost nobody, so that if I couldn't do it, I would just be able to kind of come back down, and it wouldn't be so humiliating. I do think that there is an element now of people want to do things so that they can tell other people about them. I was really struck yesterday watching those scenes from the Capitol in Washington. It was a social media experience. People were getting their pictures taken in the speaker's chair, or the guy with the horns, posing everywhere. This was essentially a content. It was a content production exercise. It was less. It was less about the thing that they were doing, although that was important, I suppose, to some of them. But it was also about, this incredibly, kind of daft idea that you can generate this unique content. That's how it looked to me, anyway.
Yeah, but that also, I guess, makes me think about what Everest is like now. The Everest that Maurice Wilson was trying to climb compared to the Everest where there are now queues of people waiting to summit, and literally mountains of trash left behind by these huge commercial groups. When you were writing this book and you sort of returned to this golden age, did you have a sense from the people that you were talking to that something has been lost in that world, that there's a kind of, we've gone past the point of no return, that the kind of early romanticism and purity of this idea of Everest is gone now? Or does it still exist?
Well, I don't think it was ever pure, because there were imperial considerations, there were sort of national pride considerations, there was also celebrity. It was something that could, make you a hero in a slightly different way than it would now, but still, it's the same impulse. So I don't think, I don't subscribe to golden ageism generally. I think each age brings its own nastiness and, normal human behavior. It is slightly depressing to see Everest become a huge Instagram opportunity, but there are other mountains. And you might think that for the, Sherpa communities and for, people in Nepal, they do view this as a kind of golden age because they're making plenty of money from it. So, you would wish that people would clear up, and it is a shame to see the highest mountain on earth. But it's, there are other mountains. Like if you're a purist mountaineer, you can go and climb all sorts of other mountains. The idea of summiting things is less interesting now than unique routes on different mountains. I don't know. I think it's complicated. I share in some of the anguish about what's happening to these beautiful high places, but I also feel like it's wrong to think that the 20s and 30s were a particularly pristine time without any of their own complications.
I was really struck by the bit in your book where you said that I think it was the Mallory expedition, part of the reason that they got permits is because they put in writing that they wouldn't beat their Sherpas, and that's one of the conditions. So you're right, maybe not a golden age. Can I come to Jeremy Dodds now, who's been waiting very patiently, who has a question, I think. Hello.
Hi, hello there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hang on, that's it. I'm just interested to know in your research whether you, and I haven't read the book, but I will be doing so, I can assure you of that, but whether you came up with anything on the pioneering aspect of his flight. Now, I asked that in the context of, at that time, cars, motorcycles, planes were all being tried out. They were new things. There was a sensation of speed that people were beginning to get to enjoy and to experiment with and to try out. And we've sort of also the risk that they would have entailed wasn't at that stage known. And these days, we know it, we've done it, it's not really any risk to drive anywhere. And I think that is a contributory factor in some of these sort of long trips made by different forms of transport. And I just wonder whether you had any insight with him as to whether the long plane journey, was part of the attraction in that context.
Oh, absolutely. So he could have, and most people would have expected him to get to Everest if he was going to go by ship to Calcutta, then by train to Darjeeling, and then overland from Darjeeling through Sikkim and through Tibet to the north side of the mountain. He opted to fly, which was newfangled. Like, no one had ever thought of doing that. The Houston Mount Everest expedition had flown over Everest from Panir in northern India the year before, which is where Wilson got the idea. But it was this astonishing, kind of boom of civil aviation. The de Havilland company was selling a Moth every single day. More and more civilian flyers were just paying their, however much it was, 60 quid in today's money, a lesson for instruction. And Wilson got 19 hours of instruction before he flew from Stag Lane to Panir, which was eventually where his plane was impounded. So he's flown all the way through Europe and across the Med and into North Africa and through the Middle East and the Trucial States and Karachi and across northern India, 5,000 miles. Tripling his air time, his experience in the air on his journey, really, from before he left. So it really was a new era. And I flew on one of these Moths, and it was just a wonderful, kind of slightly harrowing experience. They're 920 pounds unladen. They're made out of canvas and spruce and little struts of metal. They've got a 100 horsepower engine in the front. It sounds like a hairdryer. You feel every single buffet of wind. You fly very low to the ground, so you can see the world in detail. It's really the most astonishing thing to do, and the idea of him just taking off from North London one day, compass set for Everest, flying by by maps that he held in his left hand and looking out for church steeples. I mean, it is, there is something very romantic about that.
We are running out of time slightly. I have one question, and then I'll try and bring in a couple more people. One thing I wanted to ask you, Ed, is who are the contemporary Maurice Wilsons? Because I was thinking about this over the weekend and trying to think of the similar sort of breed of very close line between sort of madman and adventurer, and I was thinking maybe Alex Honnold, the guy who free soloed El Capitan, like that felt like it had the sort of same level of mild insanity about it. And then I was thinking of Henry Worsley as well. Is there anyone any sort of contemporary story that you've seen that sort of matches Maurice's ambition?
I don't think Alex Honnold is a good match. I mean, he might be, he might do things that the rest of us wouldn't do, but he does so because he's got enough skill to do so. So I think Henry Worsley is a good analogy, although you would say he was probably better prepared. I don't know really. I'm struggling to think of his name now, but there was a guy who was a grandfather who rode across the Pacific for what's his name? Oh, it'll come to me in a second. He rode across the Pacific, and he was driven by some kind of lingering sadness in his life, and I remember being very moved by that. The story, I think, that is analogous to Wilson, but slightly less grand, slightly more tawdry, is the Donald Crowhurst story, which Nick Tomlin wrote beautifully in his book, and that was from the first round the world yacht race when Donald Crowhurst started faking his logbooks, a sailor of no skill at all, and eventually committed suicide. I suppose a lot of people have thought about Crowhurst when they think about Wilson. I'm not sure who the modern contemporaries are. You might have to leave that one with me.
Maybe people can chip in the chat, and let me just check that there's not somebody. I think Hans has been making some good points in the chat about now that we're in peacetime. Hans, are you there? Hello.
Yes, sorry.
Hello.
Thank you for the fascinating talk, which I enjoyed very much. But yeah, I just wondered, how does it translate into peacetime? I mean, your story is about an escape of trauma, and I mean, there's so many threads there of something that's religion, and people are unfettered, if you will, by without religion coming through the Victorian age, but then somehow seem to crave the pilgrimage. And there's something about, I think many other people have said that in the chat as well, and it certainly resonates. I mean, I see some people with crampons up in the background of their Zoom, and similar experiences for me. So there's something about a kind of context, contemporary context, that doesn't necessarily give you a framework, and then you want some substance, and maybe that's one of the ways why we still do it today, as a kind of counter experience. But I'm also kind of troubled by the kind of social media aspect. Do you do it for yourself, or do you do it to tell other people? So I think the connection between storytelling and going for these peaks is there very, very directly in a particular way, which is why I think the writing about it is so interesting. Sorry for the slightly jumbled.
No, it is super interesting. And my only, it's not a great insight, but it's a minor insight. But in this time, when we are all very much locked down, fettered, I am absolutely yearning for any kind of adventure. And I think, I mean, it could go one of two ways. People could become very nervous about the going out into the world again and seeking adventures and meaning and substance in new experiences. I have a feeling that many people will feel, as I do, that this is a thin approximation, a parody of normal living, and that when it's safe to socially and morally, you feel like you can live again after the vaccinations, there's going to be this explosion of people wanting experiences and I would hope that at least some of them would be because they need to nourish something internal rather than get the minor dopamine hits of Instagram. So if you talk about in peacetime, well, we are in this very strange period in which we can't do the things that we dream about, we want to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why this book has landed in the way that it has now. It was nothing to do with me. The timing was completely accidental, but it landed in the middle of this pandemic when people are yearning for escape. And, I think that's the reason why so many people have read it, and why every morning my inbox is full of emails from people who read it and responded and feel something about escape and adventure because of it.
Well, we're out of time. I'm sorry I couldn't come to all of you, and there were some brilliant comments in the chat which I couldn't pull out. But I hope you'll all join me in saying thank you to Ed for not just for writing this book, which really is really full of joy and love and adventure. And if you need some lockdown escapism, I would recommend buying it and reading it. But also for this hour and allowing us to sort of dream about some of these things that we might be on our bucket lists after this is over. So thank you, Ed, for joining us, and I hope that you sort of cling on through the rest of the lockdown and you get out and adventuring soon. And thank you all for joining. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you, Basha. Thank you, everyone.